Robot Blood. Book 1, Destiny at Dawn. Prologue, The Beast. In no distinct location of the Scorn Desert, a barren wasteland for hundreds of miles in all directions, sat a weeping prisoner. The brow muscles around his eyelids were reluctant to remain completely closed and would usher in the occasional salty bead of sweat that mixed with his tears. After several minutes of straining, he had finally recalled the words his father had repeated just before the old man's execution. "We are all victims of destiny," hearing his father's raspy voice, sacrificed in a chain of events called the future, either for better or worse, the fact remains, destiny shadows every one of us. How you face that destiny can change the world, and the fate that follows it, forever. It was these last words which gave Fig Duck the final resolve he needed to die as a man. He was slouched over in the hot desert gravel, rocks digging deep into his knees, and wrists firmly cuffed behind a shirtless back. Fear had tightened its vice-like grip at the pit of his stomach, leaving him eternally frozen in dread by the mere sight of this particular reform officer. Peering behind his sweaty mat of hair, hanging over a now bruised and bloody face, a slight glitter flashed inside of Fig's eye. It was the brass star-shaped insignia of the reformists. The man standing before him bore his rank as living testaments of terror pinned to both corner tips of his collar. Together, with the unmistakable black eye patch, was a dead giveaway to the man's identity. This interrogator was, without a doubt, the same militant psycho-killer, Colonel Course of the Sovereign Alignment. A demon, dressed in the skin of a man and every rebel's worst nightmare. The colonel's well-tanned skin gave solid evidence of numerous prolonged treks into the harsh desert terrain. His left hand brandished a spit-polish 88 repeater pistol, which complemented his slightly dusty, chrome-colored uniform of the reform regime. By now the interrogation had not proven to yield any fruitful information and was now threatening to completely drain the reserves of his patience. The colonel was generous enough to give the rat a chance to be cleansed inside a reform detention camp. Instead, the pathetic being had insulted him, by refusing the offer, and as a result, condemned himself. Yet again, these foolish rebels had forced his steel hand towards affirmative action. With all the patience of a stalking tiger, Colonel Course exhaled his cig smoke, with deliberateness. Counting out a full 3 beats after, just before he permitted the butt end to fall at the foot of his boots. After grinding the cherry embers into the sand, the colonel entertained a small mental fantasy. Imagining himself, crushing the detainee in a similar and very bloody manner. The entire action added suffocating weight to the situation at hand. Enraged, the colonel swung his pistol and shot at Fig. The bullet erupted with a deafening crack from the short barrel, and dug itself straight into the ground, tossing up dirt to disperse in the wind only mere inches from the rebel rat. A last-second thought had occurred to the colonel just as he squeezed the trigger. "I almost forgot to ask the rat one last question before killing it." Colonel Course, above all things, hated to lose control of his temper, especially in the company of his fellow soldiers. He didn't like to admit that more often than not, his emotions, his anger, would supersede his better judgment. A small but noticeable amount of time passed as the colonel squelched his anger, compressing the rage he felt into a tiny ball, reducing its size, priority, and relevance, until it no longer existed within himself. Using a casual tone and pouring genuine honesty into his voice, the colonel resumed questioning the rebel. "I am sure you are curious as to how my men and I were able to locate your scrap shack," he said, while sweeping his hand through the air to encompass Fig's modest weapons shop, which was nothing more than a few camouflaged tents with firearms haphazardly displayed on racks. A few S1MU ammo crates served as makeshift tables with smaller boxes for chairs. Positioned in between those tents, was an out-of-commission 3rd-century guerrilla tank. The Beast, as Fig called it, served as a mobile headquarters for black market operations. Its hull was fully adorned with improvised armor plating, light armaments, and boasted some pretty brutal battle scars. To Fig, it was a safe place in such an extremely unforgiving environment, and quite possibly, the only home he ever knew. Unlike some interrogators, who would pace around and behind their subjects, adding a certain element of the unknown. Colonel Corse had instead opted to remain completely still. Satisfied that he had allowed enough time to have passed from his previous statement, he continued. Not long ago, our sensors were alerted by the thermohescent residues, melting off a certain piece of merchandise you housed, he said. And, quite simply, followed those same residue pollutants, to this exact location, spitting on the ground as if to literally, mark the spot of a geographical target. Even now, microtraces of radiation linger about and hover over your entire inventory, invisible to the human eye, and most conventional probes. But unmistakable by sovereignty satellites, said the colonel. Your more dangerous merchandise consists of stolen technology and mech parts. These are all far greater offenses when compared to your other wares for sale, casting his sight back on the camo tents, a crime punishable by death, the colonel admitted. That bit of information frightened Fig, causing the quivering man to instantly yank his head back and match the colonel's cyclopean gaze. Displaying a face painted fully in surprise and flush with guilt. The expression was completed only by his gawking jaw. Fig felt as if he were a ghost and already dead. Allowing the colonel's words to pass completely through his entire being. He pondered what life after death truly meant. A silent sob escaped him, knowing with certain horror his murderer stood directly before him. Sporadically returning a fretful gaze to his killer's shadow as if constantly checking the hour. For directly behind the colonel, rested his true source of power. It alone inspired mortal fear from most men. Embodied by millitons of pure machine and superior ingenuity, there crouched a giant humanoid tank. A mech. And Fig simply could not keep his eyes off it. The sovereignty employs these mechs in every way practical, issuing out urban police units, giant military peacekeepers, and hulking construction aids. The mech unit, or MU, was the new infantry of the future. A military-grade walking war machine. Although smaller than their cousin, the military peacekeepers, the MU, were a choice tool for many private security sects and corporate defense forces. Standing in the shade of his peacekeeper, Colonel Corse marked Fig's arrested focus, and added violence to his voice. "You can stop with the tough guy act," yelled the colonel. "Where is it?" "I told you everything. I sold it to a guy from the Equus port, said he needed some spare hardware," Fig offered. "Please, I don't know what else to tell you." "Liar," shouted the colonel, as he kicked Fig square in the mouth and mid-sentence. Fig lost his balance, and landed chin first onto the gravel. Just then, the colonel's radiocom opened. "Sorry to interrupt you, Colonel," a static hiss came from the colonel's shoulder. "We found it, sir." During the colonel's brief interrogation, the unit's TAC officer had keyed in a connection to a live SATCAM feed, and was now monitoring the target via GPS terminals from inside his peacekeeper. Xavier Collins, the tactical observation specialist, had only recently joined the colonel's unit and was a greenhorn to the desert. "That's good to hear. Do you have a positive satellite lock?" the colonel replied. "Yes, sir," said Collins, speaking on his radiocom. "It's headed north toward the Barrens at a fixed rate. 20 kilometers from our current position, and somewhere near Tammen." "Could be some kinda rebel trap, sir," said a familiar voice. "This lil creep is just stallin' us." The reply came from the unit's rear guard and heavy support unit, Lieutenant Colt Arthur, a well-known veteran of many grueling battles. Originally from the former city of Viale, a foreign statehood. There he fought side by side with Colonel Corse in countless battles as a joint operative. A proven warrior and completely loyal to the sovereignty, Lieutenant Arthur was, quite frankly, the closest thing to a friend the colonel knew. Colonel Corse considered his words for a moment as he eyed the prisoner suspiciously. Arthur was right about one thing. The rebels were stalling for time. And now he would make them all pay. "Collins," the colonel barked. "Contact the barracks near Tammen. Inform them of rebel operatives believed to be hiding out in the Equus port." Turning his back on the prisoner, the colonel began walking towards his own peacekeeper. "Lieutenant," the colonel said, staring at the towering heavy MU, "burn it all." Corse then quickly retreated to his own peacekeeper at a brisk pace, clearing the area. "It would be my pleasure, sir," said Arthur, in his broken dialect. After giving his reply, Lieutenant Arthur was already pulling his controls around, repositioning his heavy MU for greater coverage of the surrounding area. The Mark Series 09 was a solid MU. Among the older units of the Mark series, Model 09 was the most adaptable. To qualify as a heavy MU, it carried a boorish Gatling gun with behemoth-sized chainplates attached to its shoulder guards for support. The same Gatling gun retained a plasma-fueled flamethrower for close-quarter combat. A botched job done by a weary field mechanic, but nonetheless a suitable conversion. Picking a spot beyond the boundary of the encampment, Lieutenant Arthur activated his secondary weapon and pulled the trigger on the controls. Pillars of blue flame erupted from its fuel nozzles, where ceaseless plasma lanced out and dropped onto fabric tents, superheating bombshells. Several of the explosions ripped from inside the inferno, pushing black smoke up to dominate the sky. Once a small weapons shop, now completely engulfed by scarlet fire, furnished only death and disaster. At its center, a single heap of mutilated smolder writhed in the midst of the roaring flames, screaming in utter turmoil and agony. In one well-practiced routine, Colonel Corse unhooked himself from the hoist belt, secured his helmet, and unlocked the guidance controls, skipping the ignition checks and diagnostics since he left his peacekeeper to idle. From the monitors he watched with complete detachment as the flaming man rolled and bucked. His leather-covered hands gripped the controls, pushing them forward and driving the unit into the furnace. With a single stomp from the massive peacekeeper, he plowed the crisp flesh of Fig duct, flat into the dirt. Snuffing the flames out by rotating the unit's foot controls, shredding and grinding the meat into nothing but a stain. Ironically, as if a giant were putting out a cig. A smile spread across the face of Colonel Corse as he thought about the irony, and issued an order to Collins. "Record a log, reporting the discovery and destruction of an illegal weapons shop operated by bandits. Also, arrange for a sweep crew to come out and clean up this mess. I don't want these rats to come crawling back and scrape up anything useful," said the colonel as he lit another cig. "On it, sir," replied Collins, and static hissed from the colonel's radiocom once more.